A month ago, something very tragic happened to me. I want to vent to someone, so please listen to me for a moment. I am a 40-year-old office worker, and at the age of 26 I married my husband, who was the same age and also an office worker. Soon after, our daughter was born, and several years later our son was born. Now my daughter is in the 8th grade and my son is in the 4th grade. The family of 4 used to live happily together, but now my husband was gone and the 3 of us live together. Today I will talk about what made me that way. I was born and raised in New York, and have lived in New York all my working life. My husband, like me, was born and raised in New York. I get tired of big cities because there are too many people and it seems too hectic. I agree, but New York is convenient and there is no reason why we should move out. Saying that, I thought I would live in New York for the rest of my life. Incidentally, my husband was devoted and actively participated in housework and childcare. So although I was a little dissatisfied with New York, I was able to live a blessed life without any inconvenience. My daughter and son also had serious personalities, and their grades were excellent. They were well-reputed children at school, so I had few worries about raising them. I thought I had a happy family that was too good for me. But a few years ago, my husband was transferred to Los Angeles by himself for a long stay. This was the beginning of the breakup of our family, but I didn't know that. I said, "I'll miss you, but as it's work, it can't be helped. Take care of yourself," and sent him carelessly. However, after the period of his work there was over, my husband remained working at the Los Angeles branch office. The company ordered me to take it and insisted on it. I'm sorry, but I don't know if I can go back to New York. So I was told, and after discussing it with my husband, we decided to move to Los Angeles, both me and our children. Our children were very close to my husband and missed him, and I was worried about raising them on my own. Besides, we had just talked about having our own home, and we decided to build a new house and live there. I was anxious about living in a new place, about getting along with my neighbors, and about our children adjusting to the new school. But fortunately, those anxieties were soon blown away. First of all, my neighbor, Betty, was a very nice person and we quickly became friends. Betty had lost her husband in a car accident a few years before and lived alone. She was very lonely because of this, and she welcomed our family warmly. Betty shared her extra dishes with us, and I shared mine with her. Not only that, I sometimes invited her to my house to have dinner with us. We had a very good relationship, and since I lived in an apartment with no neighbors in New York, I was very happy to feel a connection with people. Naturally, I changed workplaces, but everyone was nice there too. Our children seemed to have made new friends right away at the new school, and they sometimes invited their friends over to our house to play. Nothing happened that I was worried about, and life in Los Angeles was very enjoyable and fulfilled every day. And because I lived in a rural area of Los Angeles, the atmosphere was somewhat laid back and relaxing. There was no rush like in New York, and time seemed to flow more slowly. I really liked that kind of atmosphere, and I was even somewhat grateful to my husband, who had been transferred to work in Los Angeles after living alone for work. About a month after we moved, Betty became a little cold. The number of times she shared her meals with me decreased dramatically, and when I asked her to have dinner in my house, she said, "Oh, today is," and stopped coming to my house. I was a little worried about what happened to her because at first she was a very kind person and friendly. As a matter of fact, it was true. and Betty's remarks became worse. One in particular was a sarcastic comment about children. For example, she said, "It seems that your children have good grades, but I am worried about their future, even if they can only study. Nowadays, they need to be able to do sports as well, don't they?" Both of my children are not good at sports, but she knew that and went out of her way to talk to me about it, which made me feel bad. Moreover, she went out of her way to stop me when I was rushing to go to work and said it out of the blue. After this happened several times, I even thought it would be better for me to keep my distance from Betty. Actually, there were other strange things that happened besides that. There was a time when my husband and I were out for work and only children were in the house. During that time, there were traces that someone had sweets in coffee. When I came home from work, there were bags of candy thrown away that were clearly not our children's favorites, and for some reason drip bag of coffee was thrown away even though they do not drink it. My daughter said, "I recently made a friend who likes coffee. She has a different taste in sweets than I do," and my son explained, "She's a very sweet girl." I didn't think it was particularly strange, so I just took it in stride and left it at that, but in fact, something terrible had happened. Then, a few months after arriving in Los Angeles, the big incident finally happened. One day I was worried because my daughter was suffering from severe nausea, so I took her to the hospital and discovered that she was pregnant. My daughter was still in the 8th grade, and I had no idea who the partner was. Who was the partner? What happened? I asked her in a panic, but she wouldn't tell me who it was. "I can't tell you. I don't want to tell Mom." But that was not going to solve the problem. "Please be honest with me. It's not just about you, it's about the baby, and it's also about me, your parent." I tried desperately to persuade my daughter like this. Then my daughter finally told me who the partner was. But it was a very unbelievable person. "The partner is my brother." My daughter said that for sure. I mean, my daughter's partner was my son. Of course I couldn't believe it, and I asked my daughter many times, "You are lying, aren't you? What are you talking about?" My daughter and my son had always gotten along so well that they didn't fight much. They never had any serious problems, and my son was only in the 4th grade. I just couldn't believe that he would get his sister pregnant. But then my son came to my side with a very pale face and said, "What my sister is saying is true. I got her pregnant." It didn't seem like he was lying, and I stood there dumbfounded. I don't remember much for a while after that. My children told me later that I froze like a doll and didn't move. After some time, I managed to come to my senses and decided to ask my children about the details. However, my children were also in a state of shock, so they just sobbed and could not give me any more details. My daughter said, "Betty," and my son clearly said Betty. I wanted to know how Betty was involved, but my children broke down crying and couldn't say anything more. So I decided to look at the security camera that was attached to the front door. My husband told me it didn't need, but I had installed it for security purposes. When I checked the footage, I found out that Betty had been at our house when my husband and I were away for work. Moreover, the day that Betty came to our house was the day that the coffee and snacks were trashed. Besides, I remembered that Betty liked coffee. I understood right away that she had done something to my children, so I decided to set up a meeting with Betty to discuss the matter. It was a holiday and my husband was working on his day off, but I called him right away and told him what happened. My husband panicked and said, "What? What do you mean?" Anyway, I'm leaving early and going home right away and came home really soon. But my husband wasn't simply surprised that our daughter was pregnant. He, too, was hiding a serious secret. Fortunately, when I visited Betty's home with my husband, she came out right away. Betty, our daughter, is pregnant, and the partner is our son. Do you know anything about it? When I asked her point blank, she replied, "Oh, really? But I don't know anything about it," she blurted out, but I didn't miss her momentary grin. I knew I shouldn't back down here, so I questioned her in a very stern tone. I watched the footage of security cameras that when my husband and I weren't home, Betty was at our house. You must have done something to our children at that time. They even mentioned Betty's name, and it's not as if you had anything to do with it. Then Betty tried not to look me in the eyes, and she was clearly slurring her words. Well, I accidentally remembered the coffee and candy trash, so I decided to bring that up as well and attack her. The day you came to my house, there was coffee and candy trash all over the place. My children said they had friends over, but it was really the garbage you ate and drank. Then Betty finally conceded and said, "Oh my God, you found out. I know everything." Betty showed no sign of remorse at all, and with a wry smile on her face, she said something like this: "I made it so that your daughter would get pregnant. I'm telling you, your husband is the one who started all this, okay?" I was angry at her attitude, but more than that, I didn't understand why my husband had to come out and ask, "What do you mean?" I asked her to continue the conversation. My husband was standing beside me, looking pale and shaking, so it was obvious that he was involved. Then Betty began to tell me the story of what had happened. First of all, your husband met me when he came to Los Angeles to work, leaving his family. He lived near here, and we met at a supermarket. I was carrying a heavy load and looked like I was having a hard time, so he asked me if he could carry it for me. I was surprised to learn that my husband and Betty had known each other for so long. When I moved to Los Angeles, my husband said of Betty, "I don't know her at all. I hope we can be friends." Here is how Betty explained it. Your husband took the trouble to carry my goods all the way to my house, even though we had never met before. I was still in the process of getting over my grief over the loss of my husband, so his kindness warmed my heart. That's how we became friends, and when we realized it turned out to be an affair. I couldn't quite accept it, so I confronted Betty and my husband. My husband was drenched in cold sweat and had lost his color, but Betty was very nonchalant and continued her story. You never know how a relationship between a man and a woman will turn out, do you? Your husband said that his love for you had cooled down, but he was glad to see me, and I was able to overcome the grief of losing my own husband. My relationship with your husband was pretty good. I was speechless at Betty's lack of common sense. I couldn't believe we were same human being. I felt how selfish of her to fill her grief of losing her husband by cheating with him. Besides, I was very shocked to know that my husband's love for me had cooled down. Anyway, when I felt like screaming out because of all the messed up emotions, Betty started talking again. Your husband couldn't forget about our relationship even after he finished working here, so he volunteered to work in Los Angeles and went out of his way to build a house next door to mine. He didn't tell you or his children, because he had already been cheating on you since he moved in. Here I had one thing on my mind, so I asked her angrily, "What made you so kind to me? From your point of view, my presence must be a distraction, right? I was sneering at you for not knowing anything about us. I felt kind of funny when I saw you so happy, thinking I was just a neighbor, so I was just being nice to you on purpose." When I heard that, I had the urge to slap Betty across the face, but I managed to stay out of it, thinking that violence was not a good idea. I'll tell you more about what Betty told me. One day your husband said that if we continued the affair any longer, you would find out. I told him that it would be absolutely fine, but he insisted that he wanted to leave me. Your husband approached me and said he had no love for you. And then he tried to dump me unilaterally. Isn't that too much? I felt tremendous anger. Is that why you became cold to me? Yes, I did. I couldn't afford to be nice to you anymore, so I blatantly harassed you. But that didn't stop me from being angry. I even wanted to destroy your husband's family. I thought I understood how my daughter got pregnant. By any chance, that's why you approached my daughter and son? Betty smiled wryly. That's right. I knew that if your daughter got pregnant and your son was the partner, it would absolutely destroy your family. I told your children about the relationship between your husband and me, and I told them that if you found out about this, it would definitely break up the family, and you would abandon them all. I did so, and the effect was so profound that they did exactly what I wanted them to do. I watched the two of them doing with crying, coffee, and pastries in hand. It was a great feeling. I felt tremendous anger. I was so sure that I would never be more angry in the rest of my life. I asked my husband, who was standing upright for the moment, "Is it true what she said?" My husband looked at me with frightened eyes and said, "Well, yes. But I didn't know anything about the story involving our children. I'm not that horrible of a person, don't think I'm the same as Betty." He began to make excuses desperately. There were no words of apology at all. That was the end of my patience. "First of all, apologize to your children," I yelled, and slapped my husband across the cheek. I was completely out of my mind at the time, and the idea that it was wrong to resort to violence on him was gone. My husband collapsed from the force of my slap. But I gave him another slap to finish him off. But Betty was still there. I glared at her, and she looked frightened. "Stop it," she tried to run away to the back room, but I stopped her by grabbing her arm as fast as I could. Then I slapped her on the cheek with all my might. That didn't make me feel better, so I slapped her in the face one more time. Then I came to my senses and thought I might have overdone it, but my husband and Betty just cried and didn't complain, so I decided it was okay. My anger didn't stop there, so I decided to say everything I wanted to say. You people should be ashamed of yourselves for bringing innocent children into this. They have been hurt so much, but you have no words of apology. At first, apologize to them. I dragged them both to my house and made them apologize to my children. The two were so frightened by my threatening attitude that they even got down on their knees. But my children's expressions remained hard, and my daughter started crying again. I never want to see my father and Betty again. My son was also angry, saying, "Even if you apologize now, I can't forgive you." My husband was particularly shocked that his own children had turned their backs on him, and he repeated, I'm so sorry, it's all my fault." Betty also nodded her head and said, "Now I'm sorry for that. I apologize." But my children's wounds were deep, and I was not ready to forgive them with just the apology, so I decided to divorce my husband. In addition, I demanded the alimony to my husband and Betty. I also told my parents-in-law, and Betty's parents about the affair. I didn't tell them about my daughter's pregnancy because it was an extremely sensitive subject. The parents were all furious and declared that they were going to insulate themselves from my husband and Betty. Especially Betty and my husband's parents were furious with them. They apologized to me and my children, saying how sorry they were. My husband and Betty were scolded so much by their parents that they were very limp. Suck on that, I thought. I also told my husband's and Betty's acquaintances about the affair, so the two of them were distanced from everyone around them at once. I hoped they would have a hard time because they had no one to rely on. It seems that Betty and my husband are having an even harder time. They both paid their alimony exactly, but they quarreled and broke up. Well, I guess that's what an affair is all about, isn't it? I don't know exactly how she is doing now, because she moved away, but I heard that she fell for a strange guy and is having a hard time making money. I heard from an acquaintance that my husband had become desperate, quit his job, and was living a rough life. He seems to have accumulated debts and is completely crippled. I don't feel sorry for him at all, in fact, I feel relieved. My daughter decided not to have the baby. She is not old enough to raise a child, and a pregnancy between siblings might cause abnormalities in the newborn. Even if the baby was born normally, the circumstances of the pregnancy were abnormal, and I knew that if the truth would be found out, it would be in for a shock and a hard life. Both my daughter and son were convinced. They were sorry for the incident, but I did not blame them because everything was Betty and my husband's fault. No matter what happens, I will never abandon you guys. If you ever have a hard time, you can talk to me right away. These words seemed to reassure them, and they became a little more stable mentally. Los Angeles had become a tragic place for me, so I went back to New York. My children wanted to go back too. I had to come back after only a few months, so it was a flurry of activity and a lot of work, but I managed. I still feel sick when I think about Los Angeles, and I don't think I'll be able to go there anytime soon. But my parents and best friends care about me and my children and say kind words to me. My parents say if you have a hard time raising children or doing housework, you can always count on me to do it for you. My best friend is a school teacher, so I can easily talk to her about my children. She said warmly, if you have any problems raising your children, don't hesitate to ask me. Thanks to the people around us, my children and I are getting back on our feet a little. I hope we can be happy as is. It was a long story, but thank you for listening. I feel somewhat better now.